Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. Sometimes I wake up feeling like it was all a bad dream, a rant that will dissipate in the light of day. I wait to hear the sound of her laughter or the sound of her footsteps as she walks down the stairs, but silence hits me like a wall. My daughter Elena is simply gone, and the worst part is not knowing where, how, or why. Elena was my only daughter, my greatest pride. I had worked all my life so she could have what I never had: opportunities. When she was accepted to college in another city, a mixture of pride and fear settled in my chest. I worried that she was far away, but she was ready to take on the world, or so I thought. It was a rainy March afternoon when I got the call. I had been working in the shop all day with the sound of hammers and the smell of grease filling the air. I barely heard my phone, and when I answered, the voice on the other end was tense, almost cold. It was a police officer informing me that my daughter's car had been in an accident. My heart stopped for a moment, but the next thing he said was what left me paralyzed. Elena was not in the car. The car had been found on a back road overturned next to a ravine. It was a road she regularly took to return to her apartment, I was told. Officers initially thought her body would be nearby, perhaps thrown by the impact, but there was no sign of her anywhere. There were no traces of blood, no footprints to indicate she had left on her own. Nothing. I drove into town that same night in what seemed like endless rain. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as my mind ran through all the possible scenarios. What if she had gotten out of the car and was injured, alone in the storm? What if someone had arrived before the officers and taken her away? When I arrived at the scene of the accident, the lights of the patrol cars illuminated the road like flashes in the darkness. The car was there, overturned and wrecked, but empty. I approached cautiously as if I might still find some trace of her. The windows were broken, the seats stained with mud, and the trunk was still closed. The rain washed away everything in its path, erasing any clues that might have remained. The officers tried to reassure me, telling me they would do everything they could to find her, but their words sounded empty, almost automatic. There was no indication that anyone else was involved, no additional tire tracks at the scene. It seemed as if Elena had vanished into thin air. Days passed, and the investigation progressed at a slow pace. They checked security cameras in the vicinity, but that road was in too isolated an area. There were no witnesses, no emergency calls related to the accident, except for the motorist who reported it hours after it happened. I stayed in his apartment while the search continued. It was a small place, decorated in his practical but charming style. His books were still open on the table, and the cup of coffee he left that morning was still in the sink. Everything about the place screamed her presence, but she wasn't there. On one of the visits to the apartment, I found something that disturbed me deeply. Rummaging through her things, I discovered a notebook she used to jot down thoughts, lists, and reminders. Among the pages, she had scribbled something strange. Names and addresses I didn't recognize. They weren't places she used to mention or people she had told me about before. I took those names to the police, but they told me they meant nothing to them. To me, however, they were a thin thread I clung to. One of the names had an address near the road where the accident occurred. I decided to investigate on my own. The address led me to a ramshackle old house on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Circling around the property, I noticed a narrow path leading into the woods. The rain was starting to fall again, but that didn't stop me. The path was slippery and winding, but it led me to a shed hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, but something inside caught my attention. There were marks on the ground as if someone had dragged something heavy. I also found traces of duct tape and an empty water bottle. Everything was covered by a thin layer of dust, but I couldn't help but feel that someone had been there recently. I returned to town with more questions than answers. I didn't mention what I found to the police. I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. Instead, I continued to investigate, asking people who lived near that area. Some mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars at night, but no one knew anything concrete. Weeks turned into months, and the official search went cold. But I couldn't stop. Every night I dreamed of Elena, of her smile, of her laughter. and every morning I woke up with the weight of her absence. One day, while once again going through the few belongings left in her apartment, I found something I had overlooked, a key ring with a small key I didn't recognize. I became obsessed with finding where it belonged. After weeks of aimless searching, I finally came up with the answer. It was the key to a locker at the bus station. Inside, I found a folder with photographs, documents, and notes written by Elena. She had been researching something I don't fully understand until now. The photos showed faces of people who seemed unknown, but the notes described encounters, dates, and places. One of the notes mentioned a man who lived near the road where the accident occurred. That name matched one of the names I found in her notebook. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I couldn't ignore him. I went to the address indicated, this time prepared for anything. It was a modest house, nothing that stood out at first glance. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I looked through one of the windows and saw that the interior was empty, almost desolate. I forced my way inside, hoping to find something, anything that would bring me closer to Elena. What I saw left me cold. In one of the rooms there was a board on the wall with photographs. Some were of unknown people, but others were of Elena. There were pictures of her walking down the street, walking into her apartment, even at the university. My body tensed. Who had been watching her? Why? Before I could process it, I heard the sound of a car approaching. I ran to hide behind a door and waited in silence. A man came in, talking on the phone, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. He had a nonchalant attitude, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But when he came into the room with the photos, his face changed. He knew someone had been there. I don't remember exactly how I managed to get out of the house without being discovered. What I do remember is the terror that came over me, the certainty that Elena had been involved in something bigger than I ever imagined. The police finally took what they had found seriously, but they were never able to connect the man to her disappearance. The case remains open, a wound that never heals. And I keep searching, every day, every night, rain or shine. Because as long as I have no answers, I can't stop wondering what happened to my daughter. Is she still alive? Is she suffering? Will I ever know the truth? The rain was relentless that night, a constant curtain that fell over the city and made everything seem darker, gloomier. The drops were hitting the windshield hard as I drove along a secondary road on the outskirts. There was something different in the air, a tension I couldn't quite explain. It was a routine call. A neighbor had reported strange noises coming from an old house at the end of a gravel road. No one had lived there for years, according to the records. Most likely it was teenagers looking for a place to drink or vagrants trying to shelter from the storm. That's what I kept telling myself as I parked the patrol car in front of the property. The house looked like something out of a horror movie, with broken windows and paint peeling from years of neglect. Through the rain, I could barely make out the outline of the building. I got out of the car, adjusting the flashlight in my hand as the rain soaked my uniform in seconds. The rusted iron gate gave way with a creak as I pushed it. I advanced through the neglected garden where the weeds were up to my knees. The front gate was ajar, a detail that made my jaw clench. I knew something wasn't right. The inside was worse than I imagined. The air was thick with moisture and an indescribable stench. The flashlight illuminated stained walls and dust-covered furniture. I moved forward slowly, listening to every creak beneath my boots. All was silent, except for the constant pattering of the rain against the roof. I explored the first floor without finding anything out of the ordinary, but the smell was more intense near the kitchen. There, in a corner, I saw something that stopped me. A door. It was small and hidden behind a piece of furniture that had been half moved. It seemed to lead to the basement. The door had a rusty padlock, but with a sharp blow of my service tool, I managed to break it. The squeak of hinges echoed in the silence as the door swung open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. A stronger smell, a mixture of rot and confinement, hit me instantly. I descended slowly, each step emitting a groan under my weight. At last, my flashlight illuminated a small, claustrophobic space. The walls were covered with damp and mold, and the floor was rammed earth. But what I saw in the center of the basement struck me at once. There was an old bed, barely more than a mattress on a rusted metal frame. A young woman was sitting there, her eyes fixed on me. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles under her eyes. She wore old, threadbare clothes and her hair was matted. She looked as frail as a shadow. Beside her, two small children were clinging to her, watching me with big, suspicious eyes. They were dirty, with clothes that clearly didn't fit, as if they had grown faster than they could change their clothes. The silence in the room was oppressive, interrupted only by the distant sound of rain. I could not speak. I couldn't move for a few seconds that felt eternal. The young girl tried to get up, but her body seemed too weak. The children stayed close to her as if they were her only source of security. I looked around, searching for more answers. There was a table with leftover canned food, rusty utensils, and plastic bottles filled with water. In one corner, a bucket served as a makeshift toilet. The walls were full of marks, lines carved into the surface, as if someone had been counting days, weeks, years. My thoughts were in chaos. Who was she? How had she ended up there? And who was responsible for all this? The young woman pointed to a dark corner. There I saw something else. An old wooden trunk, locked with a padlock that looked freshly attached. I didn't have time to think about it too much. I broke the padlock and opened the trunk. Inside I found documents, old papers, photographs, IDs, among them a photo of the young woman. It had to have been taken years ago because she looked healthier, happier. The name on the ID matched that of a teenager who had disappeared almost a decade ago. I vaguely remembered the case, one of those that go cold and get lost among piles of unsolved files. But here she was, alive, though shattered by years of confinement. I kept looking for clues. In another corner, I found a makeshift desk. There were notebooks with handwritten notes. The letters were clumsy, messy, as if someone had written them in haste or under pressure. The entries spoke of endless days of hunger, of fear, but they also mentioned him, the man who had kept her there. The details were vague, but enough to paint a terrifying picture. She had been kidnapped when she was a teenager, torn from her life and brought to this place. He had kept her here, cut off from the world, forcing her to endure things she could barely imagine. The children were his, the product of years of abuse and captivity. The sound of a car pulling up outside brought me out of my thoughts. I hurried up the stairs, my gun in hand. From a broken window, I saw the lights of a vehicle. It was an old sedan, the kind you wouldn't notice on a busy road. The driver got out, a middle-aged man in a dark coat and a cap that partially hid his face. He walked toward the house with calm steps, as if he didn't have a care in the world. I recognized him instantly from the photos I had seen in the trunk. He was responsible. I waited for him to cross the threshold before confronting him. There was no resistance. I handcuffed him as the rain continued to pour down on us, his face expressionless, as if he didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. When backup arrived, the young woman and her children were pulled out of the basement. The paramedics worked carefully, but even in her weakened state, she held the children close to her chest, like a shield. Her gaze was distant, lost, as if she was still trapped in that basement, even though her body was outside. That night, after writing my report, I sat in my car, listening to the pattering of the rain on the roof. I couldn't stop thinking about the marks on the basement walls, the notebooks filled with desperate words. I had done my job, yes, but I couldn't help wondering how many more like her were out there, trapped in dark places, invisible to the rest of the world. That question would haunt me for a long time, like the echo of rain in my memory. I grew up on a farm upstate, surrounded by vast wheat fields and dense forests that seemed to stretch into infinity. Our home was isolated, like most in that region, and the nearest neighbors lived several miles away. We were a small, scattered community, but united by necessity. Rural life has that particularity. No matter how far away you are, you always feel you belong to something bigger. The winter of my 17th birthday was particularly rainy. Storms were a regular occurrence, but that season they seemed to give no respite, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was also the winter when the tranquility of our community was shattered into 1,000 pieces. One gray morning, while working with my father in the barn, the news came. The Roberts family, our closest neighbors, even though they lived more than 3 miles away, had been found dead in their home. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the rumor spread like fire in dry grass. I clearly remember my father's face when he heard the news. He was a man of few words, but his eyes said it all. Without saying much to me, he saddled the horse and left for the Roberts farm. leaving the job unfinished. I stayed, but curiosity ate at me. When he returned hours later, his face was pale, and he didn't want to talk about it. I didn't know any more details until a couple of days later when I decided to go on my own. The rain had let up momentarily, and I took the opportunity to grab my bike and ride the muddy road to the Roberts property. The farm was surrounded by an eerie silence, broken only by the distant song of crows. The Roberts house, which had always been a lively place, now looked like an empty shell. Its windows were dark, as if they had closed their eyes to the tragedy. There were a couple of local authority carriages parked in front of the house. I hid in the nearby trees, watching as men came and went, taking out boxes and making notes in notebooks. I didn't see much else that day, but what I heard in the days that followed chilled me. The family had been brutally murdered. The father, the mother, and their 3 children. They had found no signs of a struggle and no clear indication of who had been responsible. The doors had not been forced and nothing appeared to have been stolen. It was as if someone had killed them just for the sake of it. The news shook us all. In the evenings, as the rain drummed on the roof of our house, I couldn't stop thinking about the details that trickled in little by little. They said the bodies had been found in their beds, as if they had been surprised in their sleep. Some even speculated that they knew their killer and let him in willingly. Uncertainty became a permanent shadow over our community. My father began to lock the house for the first time in my life. No one went out after dark, and the roads, already lonely, became even more deserted. The sound of the rain, which I once found comforting, now made my nerves stand on edge. One night, weeks after the murders, I decided I could no longer stand idly by. Curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, pushed me to return to the Roberts farm. I carried a flashlight and an old shotgun of my father's, more for safety than out of intention to use it. The road was dark and slippery, and the rain had started again. When I arrived, the place was even more desolate than last time. The house was closed, and the surrounding fields had become a quagmire. I entered through the back door, which someone had left improperly locked. The inside of the house was a reflection of the chaos left by the tragedy. The furniture was covered with dust, and the walls seemed to absorb the sadness of the place. I walked down the main hallway, shining my flashlight into the house. The house seemed frozen in time, as if the family could return at any moment. It was in the master bedroom where I found something I wasn't expecting. On a bedside table was an open notebook. The pages were stained with moisture, but you could still read what was written in it. It was a diary, apparently Mrs. Roberts. The last few entries were disturbing. She had written about a strange presence she felt near the house, as if someone was watching them. She mentioned seeing lights in the nearby woods at night and dogs barking for no apparent reason. On one page, the tone became desperate. "I know he's watching us. I don't know what he wants, but I can't sleep. I'm afraid for the children." My heart was pounding as I read. I left the bedroom with the newspaper in my hand, determined to take it to the authorities. But as I was about to leave, something caught my attention. On the floor of the hallway, there were some dark spots, almost imperceptible under the weak light of my flashlight. I bent down to examine them better. They were footprints. They didn't look recent, but they didn't look very old either. They were small, as if they had been made by someone barefoot. I followed them to the entrance of a door leading to the basement. The door was locked, but the lock seemed easy to pick. I used a screwdriver I found in the kitchen to open it. The cold, damp air hit me instantly, along with a metallic stench that made me recoil. I climbed down carefully, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was dark and cluttered. There were stacked boxes and rusty tools strewn across the floor. But in one corner, something captured my attention. There was a small space, almost like a hole in the wall, covered by an old blanket. As I got closer, I saw that there were more footprints on the floor, this time more defined. I pulled back the blanket, and my flashlight illuminated a small hiding place. Inside, I found dirty clothes, scraps of food, and something that made my blood run cold. A knife, still with dark stains on the blade. I backed away immediately, my mind working at full speed. Someone had been living there, watching the family, stalking them from inside their own home. It was the only explanation that made sense. I left the basement with the knife wrapped in the blanket and ran back to my bike. The rain was torrential, making it difficult for me to get home. The next day, I took what I had found to the police station. The authorities investigated further, but were never able to identify who was responsible. The case remained a mystery, an unsolved crime that even today, decades later, continues to haunt our community. Sometimes when the rain beats hard against my window, I can't help but think of that house, of the footprints in the basement, and of the monster that lurked in the shadows, so close to them, so close to us. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, a faint glimmer in a sea of shadows. It was a familiar landscape, but every time I looked toward that horizon, I felt the weight of history, the burden of the lives that had been lost in this place. He had been a war reporter for years, a witness to the brutality of the conflict that plagued this region. I had seen the worst of humanity, but the night I experienced terror in the flesh surpassed any previous experience. The evening had begun like any other. I wandered the streets of the city, searching for stories to tell. The echoes of gunfire echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that peace was only an illusion. My colleagues and I had been covering a series of clashes on the outskirts of the city. But that night, an informant took me to an area that had recently come under attack. It was a neighborhood that had survived the war, but was now torn apart. The rain had begun to fall, clinging to the earth as if nature was trying to wash it of its misery. The streets were deserted, but the air was charged with palpable tension. As I walked deeper into the area, the sound of my footsteps mingled with the trickling of the water, creating an eerie symphony. I stopped in front of a building that had been hit by bombing. The walls were blackened and cracked, and the smell of smoke and death hung in the air. I took out my camera, feeling the urge to document what had happened. Through the lens, I saw the chaos, debris, remnants of belongings, and the overwhelming silence that followed the devastation. It was a bleak landscape, but I knew it was my job to tell the story that many would rather ignore. As I walked through the rubble, I heard a sound that made me stop. It was a moan, low and muffled. Curiosity and instinct led me to investigate. I walked deeper into the building, feeling the dampness seep into my bones. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and the feeling that something was wrong came over me. Reaching a room, I discovered a man lying on the floor. He was wounded, his face covered with blood and dust. His eyes, full of terror, met mine. At that moment, I understood that I was not alone in this nightmare. The war had left its mark on him, and I was an intruder in his agony. I bent down to help him, but a deafening roar shook the building, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. Instinctively, I pulled away, and in that instant, a shower of debris fell on me. Pain stabbed through me like a knife, and I fell to the ground, feeling the world fade away around me. Darkness enveloped me, and silence became a distant echo. When I regained consciousness, chaos surrounded me. The man was gone. Only the echo of his despair remained. I struggled to my feet, feeling the burning in my body. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious. The rain was still falling, and the sound of the water mixed with the screams coming from outside. Reality hit me hard. I was in the middle of an attack, and the city was crumbling around me. My survival instincts kicked in, and I decided I had to get out of there. As I made my way through the rubble, the air became thicker. The rain had begun to torrential, creating rivulets of mud on the ground. Shadows danced around me, and the sound of chaos followed me like a hungry wolf. As I advanced, the sight of destruction hit me like a fist. Bodies lying on the ground, distant screams, and the sensation of death lurking around every corner. I made it out of the building, but what I saw paralyzed me. The street was full of people, many injured, others in shock, and some simply crying for their loved ones who had disappeared. Rain mixed with blood formed puddles on the ground, and horror was in sight at every corner. I began to move through the crowd looking for a way to help, but the desperation was overwhelming. Ambulances were arriving, but the chaos made rescue almost impossible. I saw a man trying to drag his injured son, and an impulse led me to help him. Together, we carried him to a safer place, but as we moved forward, the sound of gunfire intensified, and fear became a constant companion. Then it happened. A bang echoed through the air, and the ground shook again. The explosion was deafening, and the world became a whirlwind of smoke and dust. I felt a sting in my side and fell to the ground. The pain shot through me like a bolt of lightning. The rain was still falling, but it was no longer refreshing. It was cold and bitter, as if the sky was crying because of what was happening. My vision blurred, and the chaos faded as darkness came over me. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a dark room with lights flickering. I was in a hospital, but it was not a place of healing. It was a nightmare scenario. The atmosphere was filled with screaming and wailing. The walls were stained and the floor was covered in blood. This was no ordinary hospital. It was a shelter for the wounded in a war that seemed to have no end. The rain was still falling outside, and the sound of the storm mingled with the terror of those who were there. I tried to move, but the pain stopped me. I looked around and saw bodies on stretchers, some covered with stained sheets. Desperation was on display on the faces of the doctors and nurses who were struggling to care for everyone. It was a place of agony, a reminder that war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the confines of a hospital. My mind filled with images of those I had seen fall, of the despair I had witnessed. Death was not just a concept, it was a palpable presence surrounding me. I knew I had been fortunate that I had survived, but the price of that survival was the weight of the death I had witnessed. The hours became a cycle of pain and unease. The rain continued to fall, and the sound of the water mixed with the screams of the wounded. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those who had not been as fortunate, the sight of fallen bodies in the street, of the anguish in the eyes of the survivors, all replayed in my mind. Finally, a doctor approached me. His face was covered in sweat and blood, and his eyes reflected the fatigue and horror of what I had experienced that night. I was quickly examined, and although I was aware of the pain that shot through me, I knew that there were others who needed more urgent attention. The war had stripped this place of humanity, and what had been a hospital had become a battlefield. As the hours passed, the rain continued to fall and the cycle of suffering continued. The screams intensified and despair filled the air. I felt helpless, caught in the middle of a war that seemed to have no end. I knew I had made choices that had led me to this place, but I never imagined that the horror would manifest itself in this way. The night became a sea of shadows and screams, and pain became a constant companion. The rain poured down mercilessly, carrying with it sadness and suffering. In my mind, images of those I had lost intertwined with the despair of those who remained. Each was a story, a life cut short by conflict. When the storm finally ceased, the calm that followed was deceptive. The hospital was still filled with the wounded, and the echo of war echoed in every corner. I knew I had survived, that I had been fortunate, but the cost of that survival was a burden I would carry with me forever. The war had not only scarred my body, it had scarred my soul. The rain had taken many lives, and the echo of its wailing would continue to echo in my memory. The war had shown its cruelest face, and although I had survived, I knew I would never be the same. The terror I had experienced that night had been etched into my being, a constant reminder that peace is a luxury in a world where conflict is the norm. As I recovered, I understood that my role as a war reporter was more important than ever. I had to tell the stories of those who could not speak, those who had been silenced by the horror. The rain had witnessed something terrible, but also the resilience of those who struggled to survive. It was my duty to give voice to their experiences, and though the road would be painful, I knew it was a road I had to travel. The rain had fallen, but the echo of the war still resounded in my heart. The story was not over, it was just beginning.